You are at Lake Rant, where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Anime Watcher, who wants me to rant about the debate between Chomsky and Foucalt, which is linked on YouTube and said, remember to turn on the subtitles. Well, I watched it. Pretty interesting. And I'll go into this saying, I don't know shit about Foucalt or Chomsky. I know of them. I'm aware they exist. I feel like I learned a lot about them through watching this debate. And both of them make a lot of interesting points. It's not really particularly a conversation that is in search of a exacting point or solution or end cap. It's more of a free-form discussion about human nature and whether such a thing really exists. Basically, I guess if there was a splitting point, it's that Chomsky essentially thinks that humans have a certain innate set of qualities in their brain, in the way that we operate, that we are basically only able to have knowledge insofar as we can find it within stuff that our brain is structured to understand. So, like, if we discover something scientifically, we couldn't discover something that was outside of the parameters of what our brain is sort of capable of innately. And thus there is a sort of inherent human nature, inherent virtues, inherent senses of justice and what is good or bad, and that we should be, basically attempting to have a society in which people can live on the basis of that human nature, to have it as unchecked as possible, which I certainly agree with, though it's interesting the way that he's essentially all about this idea that the proletariat needs to rise up, fucking storm the gates, overthrow the government and implement a new system. And I think he described it as anarcho-syndicalism or something like that, which I'd have to do more research on to know exactly what the hell that means. But, his argument, which I probably agree with the most, is this idea that, what is or isn't legal is not the same as what is or isn't just. And if the government, for instance, is doing something that is unjust, it should be viewed as illegal. And you should treat the government as though it is committing a crime and to stand against it and to represent the values that you have innately. And, the part where I disagree with him is on the idea that this would be the same for everybody, that we all innately have this sense of justice within us. I mean, simply the fact that there are so many people who, clearly have a different sensation of justice, I think, is... If there is any that's at the heart of everybody, we will never understand it, or, like, I don't know how we could. I don't know how we could get to a point where we could have a unilateral idea of what is just. His argument is sort of to just do what you think is right, and I agree with that in the sense that I made this argument in my video about consensus from way back, about how there is no such thing as something being objectively good. There is only consensus good. Whatever we consider good as a society is what the most people believe is good. And therefore, you should always be considering what you think is good to be good, and not basing that on a consensus that exists before you, because consensus is shaped by people deciding, independently what is good. So, like, it's sort of like telling you to trust your instinct on some level. Not everybody can explain why something is good, but if you have the feeling that it is, there is a justification. You just might not have found it, And so I think too many people, they just buy into the consensus and uphold that as what is good, when, realistically, what is good should be defined by the fact that enough people believe it. So I agree with him in that sense, that, we should be constantly reshaping the government, reshaping the rules, reshaping the consensus by coming to conclusions ourselves and, upholding those conclusions. But, his idea that there is an inherently just answer, that, there is a correct way for people to be, that there is a correct sense of what is illegal, I don't know how he would define that. Like, I don't know how you can find, and he himself at one point mentions, like, if you pressed me on this, I'd be in trouble because I don't have a schema for it, you know? And, like, that's exactly the challenge. If you don't have a schema for it, then ultimately, you know, we're just acting on instinct, and why do I trust your instinct over my instinct? Or, you know, if you think that everybody will have the same sense of justice, I think that it's something you have to be convinced into. I think it's something that only people will learn through being told it, and that, you know, if people are being fed different stories, they're not going to come to the same conclusions, and it's always going to lead to whatever group has the most backers will be the one that gets listened to. Whichever, you know, 51% is all it takes, so to speak. So, you know, I worry about that kind of thinking for that reason. I worry about the idea of people coming to the conclusion that there is a right way to be. I think it's much safer to assume that, yes, we should all try to be as much ourselves as possible, but, you know, do not assume that do not assume that there is one baseline, anything that's one size fits all. Let's assume that nothing is one size fits all. You know, we can have certain consensuses we come to just because there's no way to live on this earth without having some kind of checking people. Like, that's basically why a government exists in the first place, is that we can't have everybody running wild and doing whatever they want, because it just won't be in my best interest to let you do whatever you want. You know, that's why we have a government. That's why we have rules. You know, and we can't necessarily strip that back to a point where it's something everybody agrees on are the only rules, because what are you going to find that everybody agrees on, and how can you prove that it's within human nature to have those traits? It seemed like Foucault was much more in doubt of the idea that there is a human nature, and he also raises a point I think is great, that, like, even if there was, like, even if humans only could, discover things via what we innately have within our minds, it doesn't mean that we lack the ability to observe occurrences beyond that. Like, perhaps, because Chomsky initially was saying that it was, like, just a structure that's inherently in our brain. Foucault argues, well, you know, you could be looking at social structures, you could be looking at, you know, economic structures, like anything that's on a bigger scale than the individual that can tell you something about science or about human nature that, you know, is not just locked within the confines of one person. I don't know if that's exactly what Chomsky meant, though. I think he was more referring to the idea that there is a limitation on what we can perceive because of the limitation of our brain. But there's no reason to think that it's impossible to exceed those limitations or to augment them, to add on to it. You know, perhaps through technology we can change the limitations of what we can perceive. Perhaps we can, change the limitations of what we can observe. And, you know, if we can interpret that data in some way, learn something new about human nature or the nature of the universe that would change the way that we perceive everything. So, you know, I think I felt it was an interesting conversation because I agreed with both guys on so many of their ideas. Foucault was sort of like, I don't see how you could feel comfortable enough overthrowing the state and thinking that what we replace it with will be better. Like, why would you assume that enough people are innately going to want what's best for everybody, or want the perfect system that you're envisioning, or the better system that you're envisioning, as opposed to a worse system that they might want? Or, this is not necessarily guaranteed going to be progressively better, and even if it is, it might be better but not worth what you sacrifice in getting to it, So he was kind of like, I have my doubts about whether overthrowing the system entirely is really the way to go. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Like, I don't think human nature is so good that, like, if we overthrew everything, the good guys would win or would come out on top. Like, even within my lifetime, I've seen where revolutionaries have overthrown a dictator only to have another corrupted force take power. And it's hard to say if it's better, as Chomsky puts it. Like, maybe it is marginally better, but how many times does this have to happen, and how many people have to be sacrificed? Like, who's left? Like, is it only perfect when there's only 10 guys left, after everyone's overthrown everybody else? I don't know. And I don't think that the structures we have in place are so broken that they need to be completely redefined. Like, there certainly is progress being made, and I think especially now, granted this conversation happened in like the 70s, I think now in the era where dissemination of information is so much broader, it's a lot harder for the government to do illegal things and not be held accountable for it. It's a lot more difficult for broken systems to perpetuate themselves when more and more people know the system is broken. And I think that there is a problem in our current society of especially young people not understanding the ability they have to make something different. I think that it's unfortunate there are so many young people who think that the only way to institute a change is to overthrow the entire system and do everything over again. Even I felt that way for a long time. Like, I used to say, I don't care about politics because you'd have to slash and burn everything to make it good. And I still think if you wanted to make it good, you would have to, if you wanted to make it like a totally functional system. But if we're just trying to make it better, I think I'll take my odds with just continuing to repair what we have as opposed to trying to completely redo it and then, in that chaos, trusting that the right people will take control or that, human nature will prevail and something good will come of it when that has not been the case, or else we would already have it. So, I'm more inclined to think that as we are capable of more holding our leaders to task and more capable of, informing people of how better to live their lives, and I think the general intelligence of the average person is rising, especially in the internet age once again, where it's so much easier for us to have conversations across a broad spectrum of ideas and distance and political ideology. Maybe it's possible for us to just repair the system we have until a point where it is functional for almost everybody without having to literally radically destroy everything, create political violence, I just think that this conversation happened during the Vietnam War, and it was an unjust war where a lot of fucking people died. We're still in unjust wars where lots of fucking people are dying, but it's so much less than that. It's so much, not to say that it's good. Again, this is just considering the idea that maybe things have gotten better. Maybe the system we already have is not as dysfunctional as it once was, and maybe, you can't rebuild it as quickly as you could if you overthrew the system, and maybe there will be more sacrifice this way. But again, we don't even know what would result of overthrowing it. It could be something worse. It could be something marginally better, but not worth the cost. So, justifying something like that is difficult. And it's not to say that I don't think it could possibly be the answer. If somebody wants to go ahead and try it, go ahead and try it and we'll see what happens, But, I'm not going to throw my hat into that ring. I think it's better to think about, how can we do this as non-violently and as in a way that doesn't have to throw everybody who's doing okay in the current system under the bus. We should be making it work for more people as opposed to saying, well, it doesn't work for everybody, so let's completely rebuild it, but now we have no idea who it's going to work for, if that makes sense.